and welcome back to Lex Out Loud, episode 4. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker, and this is a podcast for writers, readers, and all lovers of speculative fiction. I'm working on my third novel and taking you along with me for the journey. So whether you're wanting to write a novel or maybe a screenplay yourself, or you're a game master wanting to write an adventure or a campaign, this show is for you. So last time I talked about research and just basically how, at least for me, research is the first step in world building. Before I can really start to flesh out my setting, I need to know the things I need to know about it. And especially, when you're talking science fiction or really any kind of genre that you're writing in where you're creating a setting, you're not using the real world as your setting, there's going to be at least some research involved, maybe a lot, depending on what you're doing and the genre and all that kind of stuff. So I thought for today, what would be fun is do something a little different. It's kind of funny to say that because this is only the 4th episode. So I don't really know if that's enough to set a precedence yet to say that this is something different. But today, I thought I would talk about a specific thing that I've been researching recently, and also one of the things that was kind of the whole beginning of the idea for this novel for me, and that's space elevators. So we're going to nerd out about space elevators today. But before I get into that, real quickly, I wanted to let you know, as part of my Patreon, if you're interested in becoming a patron at the tier 3 level, which is $10 a month, I'm giving the patrons access to the scripts for these episodes. So at least so far, I've done this for every episode, but for most episodes, if not all, I write a script ahead of time for the episode that I use. And it occurred to me that that might be helpful to you to have access to that. If I'm talking about something and you want to take some notes, or maybe later you're thinking about something I talked about and you're wanting to remember something, and instead of having to go re-listen to the whole episode again, you can go to the script. You can do a Control F and find what you're looking for in there. If you're taking notes, it'll be a lot easier to do that from the script than just listening to me talk and trying to write things down. So I know in some of the other podcasts I've done in the past that were more, people were using them for reference, that people really liked having a transcript of the episode. And also, if you have any kind of hearing impairment or anything like that, I know that can be really useful for that as well. So this isn't technically a transcript, because a transcript would be written out what I'm actually saying on the show word for word. This is pretty close to that, but it's the actual script that I'm using when I record the episode. So it may not be word for word what I say on the episode. I don't always read the script word for word. Sometimes I will add things that aren't in the script, so that's not going to be in there because, again, it's not a transcript. It's the script that I'm using, but still a lot better than nothing. So yeah, that's available to the tier 3 patrons. So if that's something you'd be interested in, you can check that out on my Patreon page. There'll be a link to that in the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com/LOL. So yeah, I thought I'd do that for those of you that find that useful. So if you use those and you find them useful, let me know, because I'm always looking for new and better rewards for the patrons. So if this is something that people aren't really using or not finding useful, then maybe I can come up with something to do instead. But if this is something that people appreciate and find useful, then I can do that. So if you do use it and you do find it useful, please let me know. All right, so today we are talking about space elevators. And if I had to pick one idea or one concept that was the seed for everything else in my setting, the beginning to it all, it would probably be the space elevator. I'm pretty sure that was the first idea I had that kicked all this off that I really liked. So space elevators, I think, are just super cool, and they're majestic and inspiring and awesome. And yeah, there's just something about them that has always captured my imagination and always got me excited. And you'll probably find as you hear me talk through this show more and more that, at least for me, and I don't know if other writers are different, but at least for me, my level of excitement about what I'm doing is really important. When things are going well, writing doesn't feel like work to me. I have these ideas in my head. I'm seeing these scenes in my mind, and I just feel like I have to get them out. I have to get them down on paper. And that process is very enjoyable for me. And I really enjoy getting these things out of my head where only I can enjoy them, out into the world where other people can enjoy them. And that's really awesome. And I really dig it. It's really cool. But for me to be able to do that, and especially to be able to work quickly, it's really important for me, at least, to have this level of excitement and passion about what I'm doing. And if that excitement isn't there, it becomes really difficult, and I don't go as quickly, and things aren't as polished from the beginning, if that makes sense. When I'm really inspired and when I'm really excited about what I'm doing, I can write very quickly. I can crank out a lot of words in a given period of time, and the writing's usually pretty good. Like, I'm not going to have to go over it a whole lot in editing to make it flow or whatever. Like everything just kind of snaps together and really well. On the other hand, when that excitement isn't there, it goes much more slowly, and the prose isn't so great, to where I probably am in revisions going to end up rephrasing things and rewriting a lot of it. So that's just something I've noticed for myself. I have no idea how common that is among other people, if that's normal, if most people are that way, or if just some people, or if that's really unusual. I don't know. So for me, my internal kind of excitement about what I'm doing is sort of like a barometer on just how I'm doing with the project overall. And when I'm really excited and ideas are just firing in my mind and things are fitting together and I'm really into what I'm doing, I take that as a very positive sign that things are going well. And then conversely, when that excitement isn't there, I often will take that as a sign that something's missing, something isn't right, and I will try to do what I can to recapture that excitement. I remember in my last book, Dawn of Endless Night, one of the things I ended up doing for that book, which maybe I'll do that for this at some point too, was I actually came up with a soundtrack for the book. And this was in the days when you still use CDs. And I had a CD. Well, actually, I still have a CD player in my car. I just never use it. But I had a CD player in my car. So I came up with these songs that I thought, if this book were made into a movie, these are the songs that would be on the soundtrack, and burn those onto a CD so that I could listen to it whenever I wanted. And I found that was a great way, if on a particular day I wanted to write and I just wasn't feeling it, or that excitement wasn't there. A lot of times just listening to that soundtrack would get me there, would get me excited, because I had associated so many of the ideas for that book and the scenes I was envisioning with the various songs in that soundtrack, that just like when you see a good movie and a certain song plays in a certain scene, you may hear that song on the radio and it reminds you of that movie. The same kind of thing, exactly. I would start listening to the soundtrack and it would just very viscerally bring all this stuff into my mind. And a lot of times I'd get all fired up about it and I'd be good to go to start cranking out words. So yeah, maybe I'll do that for this. At this point, I have no idea what would be on that soundtrack. I couldn't even think of one song to put on it at this point. That's at least my perspective. So for me, it's very helpful on anything that I'm working on to know what gets me excited about the project. So if I am having a bad day or a rough day, I have some tools I can use to summon up that excitement if I need to. So for the last book, it was one of those tools was my soundtrack. So if I was feeling down or just wasn't feeling into it, I could try listening to a soundtrack, and a lot of times that would do the trick. So for this project, one of those things is just space elevators. I just get so excited thinking about space elevators that I imagine if I were having a bad day and not feeling it, I could just sit and think about space elevators for a while or read some articles on them or watch a video about them, and it'd get me in the zone and I'd be ready to write and ready to realize a setting in which space elevators play a pretty important part. Speaking of things not in the notes, that's something that's not in the script, but just a little bonus for you. Whatever you're working on, and not just writing, any kind of creative project, if you can kind of zero in on what are the aspects of that really get you excited, those can be great when you're having a non-productive day. You can think about those things or kind of immerse yourself in those aspects that make you excited. And it's kind of a way to hack your brain to get yourself into the zone where you need to be. So getting back to space elevators, I mean, this is just a technology and an idea that I've been in love with ever since the first time I was ever exposed to it, which I don't even remember where that was or when that was or what it was. I've just always loved the idea. And like I said, I'm pretty sure that was the first idea that this setting grew out of was space elevators are really cool. I want to write a story where space elevators are real, where they exist and they're in use. So I knew I wanted to feature one in a story. The second idea, I think, that started all this off, I'm pretty sure, was having a cylinder kind of beer can shaped rotating city-sized habitat at the end of the space elevator in orbit. So it kind of came right on the heels of the space elevator. I was like, I wanted to write a story about a space elevator. And then I thought, how cool would it be to have this huge habitat at the end of the space elevator connected to the Earth? And then ideas just started flowing from there. But those were the two seeds that all this came from. I think the third idea was probably having these orbital cities directly above the cities on Earth that they'd ultimately replace. One of my first mental images I had for the book was the cable for a space elevator anchored to the top of the Empire State Building in New York City, and that cable going all the way up to this huge spinning cylinder habitat in orbit, New York, if you will. And I, at the time, and this was years ago, I think over a decade ago, I envisioned these new orbital cities being built above all the major cities of Earth eventually. It turns out not all of those ideas are going to work the way that I originally envisioned them because, well, physics, but a lot of them will work, maybe with just, some tweaks here and there. And the important thing is I still have the excitement and the passion for those ideas themselves. I find them really inspiring. So hopefully my readers will too. Hopefully that excitement will carry through. So space elevators are amazing feats of technology and engineering, or they will be once we build one. If we think about the 31 milestones to colonizing space put forward by the National Space Society, which I talked about last week, having a functioning space elevator on Earth would directly contribute to a lot of those milestones, especially the very early ones. It would directly contribute to them. So, for instance, the first milestone for settling space is to dramatically reduce the launch costs to get people and equipment in orbit. Now, this number changes all the time. I believe the last figure I heard was something around $5,000 per kilogram is what it costs to get something in orbit right now. That number may be outdated at this point. I don't know. And I'm just pulling that out of memory. So that might not even be the correct number, but it's thousands of dollars per kilogram to get something into orbit. So there's a lot of things that we could do in space right now that we aren't doing. And a big reason is just the cost to get things in orbit. It just costs so much money to get something into orbit that it's, if you think about it from a business perspective, you already have a huge amount of overhead just from getting into orbit, and you haven't even done anything in orbit yet. So, if you want to build a space hotel or something like that, just getting all the materials to build the thing in the orbit is going to cost you so much money. How are you ever going to be able to make a profit? So it's a big deal. And that's why that's the first milestone. That's the first thing we need to accomplish is we need to drastically bring down those costs. Now, we've already started making pretty good progress on that already, thanks to a large degree to Elon Musk and his company SpaceX, who has shown, and they've done it, that reusable rockets are an achievable technology. So NASA, when we said that you couldn't do it or it wasn't cost effective or whatever, I don't know what their reasoning was, but the common wisdom was it cannot be done. All the rockets that sent the astronauts to the moon during the Apollo program, they were all disposable. All those rockets flew once and that was it. So it's super wasteful, right? You think of all the metal and everything else that goes into one of those humongous rockets, and it only gets used once. So in this day and age, it just seems insane to even do things that way. And it's like, of course, we need something that we can use over and over and over again, just like an airplane. You don't fly a 747 once and then scrap it, right? You fly them over and over again. So SpaceX is doing this with their Falcon 9 rocket, and now they're developing the Starship. And the Falcon 9 Heavy is flying now, and they're reusing these things. They're able to land them, which is awesome. If you have not seen the videos of SpaceX landing their rockets, you got to go check those out. It's something straight out of science fiction. And I still get a rush. I don't know how many times I've seen it. I still get a rush every time I see it. It's just blows my mind that I'm watching something real and it's not science fiction. It's just amazing. And you know what? I'll put a link to those videos in the show notes so you can check those out. So just from being able to reuse these rockets, we're already seeing these launch costs going down from the work that SpaceX and other companies are doing. So we're already getting there. But we're still using rockets burning liquid fuel to get in orbit. And no matter how much we improve and streamline that system, it's always going to be expensive because the rocket has to lift all the fuel that it needs as well as whatever, it's carrying. So there's kind of a limit to how cheap we can get it as long as we're using rockets. A space elevator, on the other hand, would greatly reduce the cost of getting to orbit once you had the thing built. Now, it would be very expensive to build, but once it was built and once it was paid for, you could get things into orbit pretty cheaply, especially by today's standards. Your car or whatever that you're sending up the elevator to orbit doesn't need to carry any fuel into orbit at all, as it would run on electricity. And the electricity presumably would be supplied by solar cells that are in orbit. So they would have access to sunlight practically 100% of the time, almost 100% of the time. So just in case you don't know what a space elevator is, the name is pretty self-explanatory. I think even if you didn't know what it was, just from the words, you'd probably be picturing something pretty close. But in simplest terms, a space elevator consists of a large spinning habitat or some other kind of massive object in geostationary orbit above the equator. So that's about 22,000 miles up, or about 26,000 kilometers. And at this orbit, the habitat would orbit at the same speed as the rotation of the Earth, and it would stay above the same spot on the Earth's surface. So then you lower a tether or a cable down from the station all the way down to Earth, all 22,000 miles, and you anchor it to the Earth. And this is now your elevator cable, just like an elevator in a building. And you can have cars go up and down that powered by electricity. So right there, you might already, just from this description, see a problem with my initial idea. When I first started thinking about all this, I didn't realize that geostationary orbit could only be accomplished above the equator. I mean, I knew it, but I didn't really put two and two together. I didn't realize that was going to cause a problem. So you couldn't actually have one of these habitats directly above, say, New York City and have it be in geostationary orbit connected by a cable space elevator to the Empire Space Building. Empire State Building. Oh my God. It would be in geosynchronous orbit, but not geostationary. So it wouldn't work because it would be dragging that cable around from north to south as the Earth rotated through the day, which would be really bad. However, what you can do, I found out, is you can have your habitat above the equator, but then you can have a cable go from there to New York City, for instance, and you can make that work. And the physics for that is very similar to guy wires supporting a tall antenna or a tower. So you'd have to have at least 3 cables to make that work. And at least one of those cables would have to be anchored in the northern hemisphere, and at least one of them would have to be anchored in the southern hemisphere. I'm still also picturing a cable going straight down to the equator, probably in the ocean, and anchored to a platform similar to an offshore oil drilling platform. So, this would be a tropical environment on the equator in the middle of the ocean. So you could build out an artificial island around this platform with resorts, beaches, things like that. And it could be a vacation getaway spot for people living in orbit. Now, to make this work, to have these cables going to different places other than directly below the habitat, you would need stronger cables than if it's just going straight down. So I could have an orbital city above the equator out in the ocean somewhere. It could have a cable connection to, say, New York City, and maybe one to Chicago, and maybe one to, say, Buenos Aires, Argentina, for instance. Here's a really cool factoid I learned this week. So let's say I have one of these orbital cities just above geostationary orbit, which is 22,000 miles up, with a space elevator going down to the surface, say New York City. If the car on the space elevator can accelerate at 1G, which, if you're curious, is an acceleration of about 35 kilometers per hour per second, or 22 miles per hour per second. So if you can keep this thing accelerating at 1G, you could have it accelerate at 1G for the first half of the trip, have it flip around 180 degrees, and then have it decelerate or accelerate in the opposite direction at 1G for the second half of the trip. And your passengers would be at normal Earth gravity for the entire ride, except for the few moments it takes it to flip in the middle. And the entire trip would take about an hour, which is awesome, which is exactly what I wanted. I wanted the trip to be an hour or less so that it would be feasible for someone living in one of these orbital cities to be able to take the space elevator down, have a picnic, and come back on the same day if they wanted to. And yeah, that'll totally work. So you might be wondering, if space elevators are so awesome, and if they would allow us to get into orbit cheaper and do all these other things we want to do in space cheaper and easier, why aren't we building any yet? Well, the limiting factor right now that's keeping us from building these things right now is the tensile strength of the tether or the cable that's required to make this thing work. So it turns out that any material that you might build a cable out of has what's called a breaking length or a self-supporting length. So this is how long that cable can be before it will snap under its own weight. So for instance, stainless steel has a self-support length of 25.9 kilometers. So that means if you made a stainless steel cable that was 26 kilometers long and you dangled it over a hole that was deeper than that, the cable would actually snap from its own weight. So you can't make a steel cable longer than 25.9 kilometers because it won't support its own weight. It'll break. not to mention supporting anything else you might want to attach to it. So obviously for a space elevator, we would need a cable that can be over 22,000 miles long, be able to support its own length or its own weight at that length, and be able to support the weight of the elevator cars and cargo and everything else. Because ultimately, we want to use this thing to lift things up into orbit and bring things down. So it needs to be able to support significantly more than its own weight. So to throw out some more numbers for you, to give some context here, steel has a self-support length of 25.9 kilometers. Titanium has a self-support length of 29.4 kilometers. Spider silk has a self-support length of 109 kilometers. Kevlar has a self-support length of 256 kilometers. And Xylon has a self-support length of 384 kilometers. And then we have carbon nanotubes, which have a theoretical self-support length of 5,000 kilometers or more. And then above that, we have macro scale single crystal graphene, which would likely be even stronger than carbon nanotubes. So one of these last two materials, either carbon nanotubes or the graphene, would probably do the trick. Probably the graphene would be the way we'd want to go. And there are some other factors that come into play with this as well. So the first thing is all these numbers I just went over, all these self-support lengths, are all assuming normal Earth gravity at sea level, 1G. However, as you get higher and higher above the surface of the Earth, the force of gravity actually decreases. So the self-support length of these various substances would actually be quite a bit longer than those numbers if we're talking about the space elevator, because the gravity is going to be decreasing as you go up this cable, to where at geostationary orbit, it's a very small percentage of 1G. Another thing that changes this a bit is you can taper the cable, so you can make it thicker at the top and then have it taper down thinner toward the bottom. And that increases its strength and its self-support length too. But yeah, we would probably need to be able to mass produce graphene, or at the very least carbon nanotubes, to be able to build one of these things on Earth. And we can't do that yet. Here's an interesting side note, though. We can build, or we could build space elevators on the moon or on Mars with our current technology, because both of these places have significantly less gravity than Earth. So for instance, we could use Kevlar for the cable for space elevators on the moon and the Mars. And we could build those today. We can mass produce Kevlar today. So it's further out for Earth just because we have stronger gravity, but when we get to the moon again, or we get to Mars, we could build one there sooner. So this technology may be a way off, but I think it's definitely coming. I mean, assuming we survive long enough. Graphene will be an extremely useful substance in space. It's the ideal thing to make the hulls of our space habitats out of, for one thing. So if there's a way to mass produce it economically, we'll figure it out. I'm sure we'll be able to do it once we have nano construction capability, if not before. So I mentioned before that one of the things I want to accomplish with my world building is to figure out exactly when the story is taking place. So this is going to be determined to a large degree by the technology that I want to have available. And, in order to do certain things, you need certain types of technology. Like, for instance, in order to build a space elevator on Earth, we need to be able to mass produce graphene. So that's a must. For my setting, I've got to advance far enough in the future that it's conceivable we could mass produce graphene, because we're going to need that for a lot of the things I'm going to want to do. Another big one is probably going to be the ability to have efficient nuclear fusion. And I may go over that in a future episode. As things are going now, if I had to guess, I'd guess that we'll figure out fusion before we can mass produce graphene. But I mean, who knows? Time will tell. It does seem like fusion is getting closer and closer all the time to getting that efficient enough that we can get loads of energy out of it. But that does give me two good data points to consider when I start thinking about my timeline. How long is it going to take to get fusion where we need it? How long is it going to take to mass produce graphene? And that'll give me a ballpark of how far in the future I need to go at least. Because you never know, there could be a war or something and things could take significantly longer than we think they will. Or something could happen and things could take far less time. For instance, a lot of horrible things are happening in the world because of this pandemic right now. But certain technologies have been advancing far more quickly than they were or than they were going to because of the pandemic. Among those technologies are various types of robotics, especially in manufacturing. So the environment could change as far as how fast these things happen. So, all we can do is take our best guess when it comes to this kind of stuff. So let's get back to the National Space Society's milestones for colonizing space. As I said, having one or more space elevators would directly contribute to the first milestone, which is reducing the launch costs to get into orbit. However, it's going to pretty much directly or indirectly contribute to every other milestone as well. And that makes sense, really, because these milestones build upon one another. So, for instance, the second milestone is continuous human occupancy of low Earth orbit, which will be a lot easier to accomplish when we have space elevators to get things in orbit much more cheaply than we can today. Milestone 3 is development of a space tourism industry. And again, a space elevator is going to be a huge help in that regard as well, and so on and so on. I think the space elevator is a great example of why I love mundane and to some degree hard sci-fi so much more than space opera. Space elevators are so cool, and these huge spinning cylinder habitats are really cool too. But we seldom see these kinds of things in popular science fiction because so much of it is space opera. And they have magical solutions to things like artificial gravity, transporters, warp drives, hyperdrives, lightsabers, et cetera, et cetera. So we don't get to see these super cool, innovative, ingenious technological marvels because their job is done by magical, quote, technology that isn't possible with our current understanding of physics. Shields like we see on Star Trek and Star Wars, not possible. Lightsabers, not possible. Hyperdrive, not possible. So you can have some cool spectacle kind of stuff going on with that kind of stuff, just like with the Lord of the Rings, right? Like you can have some cool moments of cool effects or whatever. But at least in my opinion, it's not nearly as inspiring because it's not real. It's make-believe, it's pretend. On the other hand, seeing something like a space elevator on the screen is so much more inspiring because it is real, or at least it could be, it will be, and something that we could see in the not-so-distant future. So at the end of the day, that's what I love most about science fiction. It inspires me. It makes me think. It makes me ask questions I never thought of before and wonder what the answers might be. It gives me hope and excitement for the future, considering what we might be capable of someday. I find Star Trek and Star Wars and The Lord of the Rings much less inspiring because it's mostly or completely make-believe. And I hope that makes sense. I mean, people are never going to be wizards. It's not going to happen. People are never going to be flying around on ships like we see in Star Trek or Star Wars. It's not going to happen because those things aren't possible. They're not real. They're fantasy. They're make-believe. But space elevators will likely be real someday. It's based on real science, real physics, and it's really physically possible. And that's pretty damn inspiring, at least in my book. So there's a little bit about space elevators. I'm not trying to give you an exhaustive description of them, more really focused on what I like about them, why I think they're cool, why I'm excited about them. And yeah, in my setting, there's going to be quite a few of them on Earth. And they'll also be on the moon and Mars and probably some other places as well in the solar system, especially any lower gravity places. They'll be there. So if you want to learn more about space elevators, head to the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com/LOL. And I've got some links for you. I've got a link to a great video by Isaac Arthur on space elevators. And if you dig it, he's got lots of videos about space elevators on his channel. A link to the Wikipedia article on them. Again, I'll have that link to the National Space Society's roadmap to space settlement if you want to check that out. It's a really, really cool document. I'll have a link also to the Wikipedia article on graphene if you want to learn more about graphene. And yeah, finally, I'll find some links to some of those SpaceX videos of them landing those rockets. It's really amazing stuff. I mean, if you're at all into science or science fiction, you probably already seen them. But just in case you haven't, yeah, I'll have some of those in there too, because it's really cool stuff. And that's not even as, quote, real as space elevators. It's really real as in happening right now. Really, really super cool stuff. So kind of took a different approach today, just kind of nerding out on space elevators. But I would love to do more topics like these. So if you like this or you'd like to hear more like this, let me know. Some other things I'm considering talking about in future episodes are O'Neill cylinders and similar things. And oh yeah, this one I'll probably definitely do is a discussion on spaceship defenses and weapons, because that's another thing that is actually, in my mind, a lot cooler when you get into mundane or hard sci-fi and away from the magical space opera stuff. Yeah, I think it's actually, the more realistic stuff is actually a lot cooler than what we're used to seeing. And it's also kind of interesting, some of the reasons that we're used to seeing the things we are actually have nothing to do with plausibility and everything to do with production costs of television shows. So that's kind of interesting stuff. So I'll probably talk about that at some point. But I'm continuing to world build. That's where I'm at in my process right now, just fleshing out the setting. And I tell you what, every time I work on it, I get more excited about it and I have more ideas bouncing around in the back of my head. So it's working. The method is working. So I hope you're enjoying the journey with me. And yeah, let me know what you think. And I'd love to hear from you. And again, if you're working on something yourself or you're about to, let me know about that too. You can email me at lexoutloudpodcast@gmail.com. You can call my voicemail at 951-465-5391. If you want to support the show and become a patron, you can then join our community on Discord, and you can find links to all that stuff at starwalkerstudios.com/LOL. Thank you again for listening, and I will be back with another episode soon. And in the meantime, keep writing.